Hi, this is Meredith Elliott Powell, and you know what time it is. It is time for Thrive, the show where we dive into the strategies, discuss the steps, everything that you need to know to turn all of this uncertainty into your greatest competitive advantage. Now, I've got a really special guest for you today, and we're going to talk about a topic that I'm going to tell you with. I feel like I'm struggling a little bit with in my business, because I think as the marketplace starts to shift, and we all know that it is starting to shift right now, market differentiation in a global marketplace, market differentiation in a competitive marketplace, and market differentiation in a marketplace where inflation is rising, interest rates are high. And in other words, your decision makers are watching their pennies. Market differentiation is probably everything. And I have brought the expert with you today. On the show today, I have got Mark Levy. And Mark, as I was going through your website, and I definitely know you from National Speakers Association and everything, but when you really get into your website, it's fascinating. The organizations, the people that you have worked with, and you classify yourself as a differentiation expert. And let's start there. Let's really talk about what that means. And just so the audience understands, I mean, this is a man who gave Simon Sinek his why. This is a man who has worked with the likes of Marshall Goldsmith. I mean, you've really helped some of the biggest, not only names out there today, but people who really are known more for something rather than their name. So let's start with what a differentiation expert is.
Yeah. So differentiation, I'm a business strategist. I know all kinds of forms of business strategy, but what I specialize in is differentiation, which is a part of strategy. It's just one of the pieces. And what it is essentially is it's what's going to make you stand out and what's going to make you stand out for the right reason. Because if what you say to the world is only what the world expects to hear, they have no reason to listen to you. That it is essential. You're not showing off. It's a survival strategy. It is essential that you stand out for something that's important in people's minds. And that idea or that product or that service, whatever it is, it can be life-changing for your marketplace, but it doesn't have to be. I always give the example. Years ago, there was a famous delicatessen in New York City, in Midtown, that instead of when they would serve you the sandwiches, the sandwich would be a foot tall.
Okay.
Like, so you'd sit there. No one needs to eat a sandwich that's a foot tall. There's no one listening who needs to eat a foot tall sandwich. So to me, the idea specifically of the foot tall sandwich was that food is a very social situation. When you go out to a restaurant in New York, you're usually going with friends. And so when you get your foot tall sandwich, you have something for you and the other person to talk about. You have people next to you looking and talking to you and taking pictures, and you're posting it to the internet and whatnot. So that foot tall sandwich was all about standing out, but around facilitating something important. It was the reason why people were there. It was conversation and eating. Does that make sense? So no matter what you're doing in the world, no matter what your business is, whether you're a thought leader or you're a manufacturer or whatever it is, you kind of need your own version of a foot tall sandwich.
So let me ask you this. So you say that you're a business strategist and your area of expertise, your area of focus is differentiation. How did you get to that? Because Mark, it was interesting. I was thinking about this weekend having you on the podcast, and I was thinking about how long has differentiation, I know it's been around forever, but when did it become so incredibly important? Like you said, it's critical today. You're not going to make it if you don't have a differentiator.
That's right. That's
yeah.
right. So the idea of differentiation, we can debate about when it truly started, but certainly in the 19th century or so, when people were selling soap, because a product cannot speak for itself, would have to manufacture a reason for it to stand out over the others. So this soap was 99 and 44 100% pure. This soap was 20 mule team tough. This soap floated in water. This soap was on a rope. This soap was in flakes. This soap was in liquid. This soap had grit in it to clean things through. Like they all had different, and we have since taken the idea of differentiation, which was used to sell packaged goods, and we've applied it to personal brands along with our other brands. So essentially, we're kind of misusing differentiation. But that's because there are 8 billion people in the world, or 9 billion people, and everyone supposedly has a personal brand and a way of reaching out into the world. So you kind of need to stand out from that sense. The idea of differentiation, as we talk about it today, in 1969, Al Ries and Jack Trout wrote the book Positioning, and differentiation was an important part of that. So that's why differentiation has more come to the fore today. And also the huge glut of, like, you have so many different people and companies trying to stand out now that it's
Yeah.
essential that you stand out, even if you didn't want to stand out before. Even if you just thought that your good work would make you stand out before, that's actually, I'm sad to say, not the case.
Yeah.
Need to adopt a position or an idea or a strategy that almost acts as an attention grabber and a mnemonic out in the world.
So where does one start? I mean, because I'd love to, again, I've really been thinking about this a lot. And I think that so many businesses understand they've got to do this, so many business leaders, but not very many do a very good job at it. I mean, when I was really thinking about products or thought leaders or people that really stand out in my mind, there really aren't that many. And what we're really talking about is something that's very mainstream. I think if you go to any business conference, any sales conference, everybody's talking about, value proposition, market differentiation. I mean, some language around it. Where does one start with it, and why do so many people derail from doing it well?
I'll address both, but I'll
Yeah.
address them in reverse order.
Okay.
Why people don't do a good job, because everyone tries to stand out.
Yeah.
But it often happens that I'll quote a colleague of mine, Rory Sutherland, who's the head of a major part of Ogilvy in the UK.
Okay.
So Rory, in a book of his, talks about so this is going to be all about logic. So
Okay.
the thing that derails people is that they try to stay too logical in how they differentiate. But when they stay too logical, what that means is that they're moored to what already exists in the world. So, like, oh, yeah, if your product's blue, mine's going to be red. You know what I mean? Like, you're
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
to what's out there. So that's what I mean by logical. You're only going to be 1 or 2 percentage points to the right or left of what already is, and that won't hold anyone's attention. It's not interesting enough to stay in anyone's mind. So Rory, in one of his books, he says that logic robs the world of magic. That when you're too logical in your differentiation, you become predictable and hackable, that people know what it is you're going to do and what it is you're going to say. And it's easy to make an end run around you to do something different. He says that that's why these major entrepreneurs, that's one of the reasons why their work is so valuable. People like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel of PayPal and James Dyson of the Dyson vacuum and Steve Jobs and people like that. They're important because the logic that they use would never be okayed by a committee, that they seem, quote unquote, certifiably bonkers. And because, like, no one said, I want a really expensive, complicated, NASA looking vacuum cleaner for my house. Like, no one said that, but James Dyson came out with it. And one of my favorite stories about this is, like 18, 20 years ago, there was a soft drink company. I forget if they're in Central America or South America, and they wanted to bring their cola to the United States and do battle with Coke. And so they hired a company that did taste tests, a marketing company. And the marketing company said, we've been doing this for a decade. We did a taste test. And here's the bad news. Here's a Wordle, a word cloud.
Yeah.
All the words associated with your drink, because we did an extensive market test.
Yeah.
drink in North America. And the word that came up most often, the giant word here on the word cloud associated with your cola, was the word disgusting. That people drank your cola and the word that came most to their mind was disgusting. So it's unfortunate they hate the taste. You're not going to fare well against Coke. So the company thought about like, oh, so how do we do battle with Coke when we won't be able to match their taste? Because the logical thing with a cola is just to compete on taste, right? That's what a cola is for. It's the
Yeah.
taste. That's what you're buying. So
Right.
said that's the logical way. Let's change the flavor. But that's the logical way to compete. They knew they weren't going to deal with Coke that way. So they said, wait a minute, we already have a lot of caffeine in our drink. Maybe we can put in more caffeine and maybe we can make a new category. So let's, instead of calling ourselves a soft drink and a cola, let's call ourselves an energy drink. That category didn't exist yet. Let's call ourselves an energy drink. And as a matter of fact, let's name our cola, instead of the name we were going to call it, let's call it Red Bull. Because in our country, there's bullfighting, and Red Bull is a term for when you injure a bull and it starts going insanely angry, like foaming at the
Yeah.
mouth and going just nuts. So let's call our thing Red Bull. It's an energy drink. Let's, with this extreme idea, let's do publicity stunts. Like, let's sponsor a guy, not just who skydives, but is literally in outer space. He's 23 miles up above the earth and he jumps out with a parachute. And let's sponsor hang gliding and cliff diving. And let's have an extreme sports magazine. And let's not sell our drink in a can, a 12-ounce can, or a 2-liter bottle like Coke, because let's say our stuff is like nitroglycerin. You wouldn't sell nitroglycerin in a 2-liter bottle. Let's put it in a smaller can and one that's hard to crush because it's so powerful and like all those things. And so everything that they did was beautifully illogical. It was very much against what everyone else was doing. And that's why they stood out. So often I encounter brands or companies that say they want to stand out, but they kind of want to stand out among in all the predictable ways. And that's not going to work. Seth Godin, the great marketeer, said all the boring spots are taken. We're going to have to be interesting.
Does listening to your customer, is that involved at all in differentiation, or is that a logical path to go? Is it more of like a, Steve Jobs and the customer, you've got to be one step ahead, like, Apple was. And I imagine people were, coming and saying, we want so much caffeine that we want to be like a crazy bull running around, right? Like, and let me ask another question with that. If you're looking to be illogical and you're getting really out of the box, is this a testing mechanism? Do you try something, and if it fails, like, if it's not logical, do sometimes they not work and you have to revamp them? That was a lot of question, but I'm fascinated by the process.
Oh, yeah. Well, so to me, it depends if you're starting with a product or you're starting with a philosophy of your service. You said, do you start with the customer? It's important that you start in the customer's universe.
Okay.
That you start in their universe. Otherwise, they won't understand what it is that you're selling. So I'll say this in a very prosaic way. Here's an elevator speech format that I had created years ago. So let's say you're not selling, I work with these billion-dollar companies, but I also work with thought leaders and people like that. So let's say you're a leadership expert. So a way to start in their universe would be saying something like, oh, if someone says, what do you do? Well, what it is, I'm a leadership expert. So companies like Amazon and eBay hire me to work with their leaders so that their leaders can lead way better. But I do leadership in a really unusual way. So here's how I do leadership. And then you talk about here's how people normally do leadership when they're trying to lead or when they're trying to coach leaders. And that doesn't really work that well, or it doesn't work well long time. or it burns bridges or whatnot. Here's really the way to do leadership if you want lasting big time change. And then you explain, you say, that's what I do. So do you understand what I did in starting with their universe? I started
Yeah.
by saying, oh, I work with Amazon and eBay or whoever. I was making it up, on to help their leaders play better together and lead. So you're starting, they get, oh, I know those companies. Oh, you work with leaders. Got it. You help them work better together. But
Yeah.
then you preface by saying, but I do this work in a really unusual way. It's not a way that you've ever really seen before. And
Yeah.
you can then either go to what makes it unusual, or you say, here's how people usually approach leadership. And you tell,
Yeah.
and it works with products, with services or whatnot. But you start where they are. Oh, this is what this is for. And then you bring in your difference.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Mark, because it's like I'm even just thinking of Red Bull. I mean, if I had before Red Bull became Red Bull, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily know that I would need a drink with more caffeine in it. But when Red Bull comes up and says we've created, like you need a drink has caffeine, which gives you energy, but like what if you had more caffeine? What if you just had all this energy to become this incredible adventurer just with one small can, it could take you that it takes it from, but I needed that first piece so I understood what the heck they were talking about.
That's right. And I often,
Yeah.
so often, people will lead with an unusual difference in what it is they're doing, and then no one wants to speak to them.
Yeah.
Like if you've ever been, everyone listening, you've been at conferences, I'm sure, and you introduce yourself to someone, and then they introduce themselves in some bizarre way about their philosophy,
Yeah.
or I'm a Sherpa to human resources or whatnot, and you want to say, "Oh my God, get away from me!"
Right.
It's like you because they're starting where they are, and to me, it's kind of rude. You got to
Yeah.
start where I am, and now, to put it this way, people want to define you, and you want to let them define you. Otherwise, they will be nervous because they won't understand what you are. So
Mhm.
you want to let them define you, but then you quickly take them to this new world where better things are.
So how does one know that their differentiation, that what they've chosen and what they're hanging their hat on is working? I mean, is it the fact that you're like, I mean, if it is in business that you're increasing, you're being sought out, like what are some of the metrics around it when you know you've landed on it?
Oh, yeah. It's everything that you would anticipate. It's increased revenue, increased market share, but it's all kinds of things like that. But also really important is that the right people are talking about you.
Mm,
So to me, it has always been an important part of my background. As you can see with some of the clients, like
yeah.
the ideas that we've created are known by hundreds of millions of people throughout the world.
Mhm.
So this idea of what are people talking about after they've experienced your product or after they've experienced your service or after they've spoken to you. And by the way, where that comes from, I'll tell a very quick story, and it sounds like an aside, but it's not. You see that poster, Steve Cohen, the millionaire's magician. So I have a long background as a magician. I've
Oh,
created magic tricks and shows. I've written book for Random House on magic. So aside from being a business strategist, I do magic and create magic shows. And so 24 years ago, Steve Cohen and I created a show called Chamber Magic. It was a magic show. Today, that show's run for 24 years. It's the highest rated live show on TripAdvisor in New York City, rated higher than Hamilton and Wicked. There is a
wow.
Chamber Magic Day by proclamation of the mayor of New York. Our clients are people like Warren Buffett and Barry Diller and, like all Guillermo del Toro, like just all kinds of people. So it's a huge, huge success. But when that show first started 24 years ago, we created this magic show, and I would go into the audience after the show because we didn't have a lot of money back then. And
Okay.
I just walk up to people And I'd say, I'm with the show. I'm really interested. What was your favorite trick in the show? I was just interested. And people would talk to me very excitedly about a trick. And I'd go from person to person informally. It was not a formal thing. And I would do that over the course of months. And if there was a trick that no one ever talked about, Steve and I would pull that trick out and we'd retool it, or we'd get rid of it and substitute a new trick, because each trick had to be the show itself, but it also had to be the marketing for the show.
Yeah.
So I knew that if people weren't talking about a trick right after seeing the show, they were not going to talk about it when they got back home. And now the show would die because
Right.
people were not talking about the tricks in the show. So this idea that what it is that you do needs to be so compelling that important strangers, it will be the subject of conversation even when you or your product are not around, is what drives everything I do. It's
Yeah.
what are people talking about even when you're not around? So you have to own the conversation. You've got to be the center of the conversation. That's how I base things on.
How often does your differentiator have to be tweaked or updated?
Oh, yeah. Great question. In today's world, it has to be tweaked or updated far more often. It used to be. So I'll put it this way: what you symbolize should stay the same,
Mhm.
or stay like roughly the same. Like what your higher calling is that's not transactional. That's not up for grabs. That should be something. It's not a gimmick that you should like trade off. Like if it's truly something that's important to you and it symbolizes what you're trying to do in the world, that's what you're about. It's not up for sale.
Yeah.
But the differentiation around your products or your services or so may need to change, and your product or your service may need to change. I think this might be another Seth Godin. I had mentioned Seth before, so I think this may be another Seth idea that I read once, where he said, if you don't have a good story around your product or your service, you need to throw your product or your service out.
Wow.
So the story is so important. Otherwise, it's not going to be used.
Right.
So it's almost like the story is almost more important than the product. I hesitate to say that, but it's an interesting idea just to have in mind as a design parameter if you can work with it. But
Yeah.
that's just how important talking about your stuff is and what your stuff symbolizes is.
Wow, this has been fabulous. Hard to believe, but we're basically to the end of this podcast. I always like to finish with two questions. You
Yes.
can answer them in either direction. How do people, either order, how do people find out about you? How do they find out about the work that you've done, the incredible people that you've worked for? And then for our audience, and the premise of the podcast is thriving in uncertainty. What is your best piece of advice as we look at, at the coming year? We're recording this at a time where we're headed into what is a tiny bit of a volatile election, and business will certainly be uncertain as we head into that. What is your biggest piece of advice for business owners, business leaders, if they really want to thrive in uncertainty?
So first I'll answer how to contact me, because that's the easier one. And
Yes, that's
once
right.
my contact information, then I'll think of the answer to the second one. So the first is, so my website is levyinnovation.com, Levy innovation.com. And my email is Mark, M-A-R-K, at levyinnovation.com. And you can always reach out to me there. My phone number's on the site and so forth. You can always reach out to me that way. The most important uh, piece of advice on how to thrive, there's so many of them that I'm going to say, but I will say something super important. It may sound trite, but you won't last without this piece of advice. Again, it is essential in getting word about your movement out there, your social movement, about your product, about your service, about your book, about whatever it is that you're trying to do, that you essentially need to jolt your audience. that if you were so jolting doesn't mean a small thing. It means it's a jolt. It's like an electric shock. And so it's this idea of what do I know about what's happening in the world that they don't know? What
Correct.
ideas, insights, exercises, stories, what do I know that they don't know? And you need to seed what it is that you're doing for the marketplace and what you're telling for the marketplace with these jolts so they pay attention to the most important things that you have to say. Because without those jolts, they are going to turn away.
Yeah, because they're almost overwhelmed with too much opportunity out there. It's a mind numbing.
That's right. That's right. So the jolt is not a nicety, jolting them is essential.
Yeah, that's excellent. Mark, thank you. This has been such an unbelievable conversation. I feel like we've scratched the surface. So I definitely want to have you back on. I want to dive deeper into this conversation. So we will have all of Mark's contact information. Listen, if you have not been on his website, you need to go out to levyinnovation.com. It is not only fascinating the list of people that he has worked with, the companies that he has worked with, but it's just really, really important information that I almost feel like differentiation has become a word like culture. It's just too vanilla. People don't really understand it, and they don't understand the importance of it in today's marketplace. So again, thank you so much for your time. Wrap this up, put it up in a podcast. We'll see you all right back here for another episode of Thrive.